hopefully you're all online and able to hear me. My name is Charlie Keeney. I'm from NHS Improving Quality, and we're acting as hosts for this series of webinars with colleagues from Arden, GEM, CSU. Particularly warm welcome to Simon Angelides, Programme Director, who'll be talking to us about the issues around governance of service reconfiguration, particularly interesting topic given the breadth of partnerships that are often involved with reconfiguration. And we know from recent HSJ surveys that between 50 and 70% of organisations are talking about the potential for reconfiguration this year. And I think obviously post-general election, people are probably likely to really start advancing those plans. A really helpful indication is for those folk who joined us on the call, and using the polling facility on the right-hand side of the screen, so about halfway down in the grey functions box, there's a poll. So if people want to let us know how many people are thinking about reconfiguration at the moment, so please select one of the answers. Hopefully you can see the two fields. And if you just click on there, that's about 50% have voted, 2/3. Okay, so that's about 3/4 of us voted, and a really healthy smattering, not surprising given the topic that nearly 90% of people are thinking about reconfiguration. So Simon's going to talk to us shortly, go through a set of slides. We'll probably pause about halfway and pick up any questions. Within the right-hand side on the of the screen, there's a facility to raise any questions, and also a chat if you've got problems with AB and you'd want me to put those questions across to Simon. So I'll hand over to Simon now and look forward to picking up questions throughout the session. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Charlie. This is the third of our webinar series, and as Charlie outlined, we're going to be looking at collaboration and governance, and just thinking through how good governance can support the reconfiguration of clinical services. In my experience, having this set out right at the beginning and getting this set up so that it's not only able to demonstrate good governance, but there's confidence in the governance of the programs that's being run, both in terms of the staff, the clinicians that are going to be making decisions, but also in terms of the wider public. I think it's an absolutely essential building block for the way in which you've moved the programs forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at different approaches to collaboration and how they might support governance, what good governance looks like in the context of a service reconfiguration, and focus on 4 practical areas that we can look at that really support the way in which clinicians and stakeholders and the program team that will be supporting any change program can actually consider and use these assets and approaches to go and support this. Again, the idea of these webinars is that they can be applied to any type, shape or clinical service, and especially in the way commissioners are going to respond to the new models of care. And as with the rest of the series that we've had so far, the concepts support the recent NHS guidance in 2013 for delivering service change. So, in starting out, are there any methodologies or approaches out there that can help shape the way in which organisations collaborate? Which ideas have worked and how can they be best applied? And how does good governance influence the starting point for a service reconfiguration program? So when you're setting out, what are the key things that you need to be thinking about when you start the journey that will really set the foundation for the program going forwards? Again, as I said, it's about not only having confidence within the program, but also being able to demonstrate that confidence to the wider stakeholder community. But also, I think this is, for me, one of the really critical points, is that getting a good governance framework right from the off is important in terms of being able to respond to challenges later in the process, because any service reconfiguration is very much about building on the blocks that you've built before. So if you can get the foundations set out properly, you have a much stronger basis on which to go and move the program at pace and at scale. So in this slide, I've looked at a couple of change methodologies that have been used in academia over the last 50 years for thinking about the way in which change can be applied within organisations. So these are very much traditional change methodologies that consider the full life cycle of the change. There's many more out there. I've just picked two that sort of take slightly different approaches to the way in which we think about change. The reflections I have on this are very much around a number of key areas. The first is that change methodologies often reflect the fact that those that are making the decisions actually have full control over the decisions and also full control over the resources. Within a service reconfiguration, you're very much in a collaborative position, and also as commissioners you don't have that full control over resources, and also the decisions that you're going to need to make will need to reflect those of the local health economy, the position of the providers, external conditions like workforce and the ability to recruit those sorts of workforce. So whilst typical change methodologies can be used to be going applied in a service reconfiguration context, often they have a framing which I think is unhelpful because of the collaborative environment that you're trying to go and work in. The second thing to say is that service reconfiguration, and if we look at these two methods, is very much focused on a relatively small part of the change process. Significantly more is about the way in which organisations transact that change, so moving from communicating the vision to institutionalising the change, and in the one above it's about execution of the intended change to ensuring that it becomes permanent, whereas service reconfiguration is very much about developing a shared vision and then communicating that vision and assuring yourself of that vision. So service reconfiguration is very much about a small slice of those processes. And the final thing I would say is that service reconfiguration isn't a linear process. This is very much a step-by-step approach that you would take in terms of moving from the left to the right. Service reconfiguration is very much a iterative process. It means that we can go back as well as go forwards, which again is why good governance is important, because it allows you to have a firmer set of foundations on which you can build the program. The other thing to say is that service reconfiguration is focused around a set of clear gateways, either through discussions with the NHS England or the TDA, also with other bodies like the Clinical Senate. So being clear about how you move through those gateways and being able to communicate that shared vision with those gateways is really important. So whilst I think it gives an overall framing, and from a health economy perspective I think it's helpful, I think in terms of service reconfiguration it's a much narrower process that we're talking about. The NHS also has its own methodology, so I've picked one from the Leadership Academy and one for improving quality. Again, I think these are really helpful enablers, especially when you're starting out the process, or if you get stuck in terms of being able to hold back, move the discussions up a level, and really think about where you're trying to get to and what you're trying to do to ensure that everybody's aligned in terms of the process. I see them very much around helping create shared values, share processes as a set of key enablers, but it's about the leadership characteristics of what you're trying to do in terms of moving the process forward as an overall leadership package. I've used this slide before in terms of a methodology that us in Arden Gemma are developing at the moment in terms of thinking through the process that you need to go. So if we think back to the Leadership Academy and the IQ models in terms of the change model, for instance, they're very much at the system end, the leadership end of what you're trying to deliver. With this model, it's very much about the transactional process that you'd need to go through, right from developing the strategic context and developing the case for change through to that implementation approach that we talked about that was much more of the focus of those change methodologies. From that perspective, I think this works at the transactional level, whereas those work at the system leadership level, and therefore I think you can think about it both in terms of building upwards in terms of being able to support that system leadership, but also working downwards in terms of creating that shared purpose and shared values that will be able to drive the process forward. I see these as very much complementary in terms of each other, in terms of the way you would think about the process of going through that, and depending on where you are in terms of the development of the process, the alignment of the stakeholders, the focus might be on one or more of these methodologies as a way of moving that forward. So I don't see them being as mutually exclusive, but I see them as being able to build depending on where you are in the program. So the final part in terms of this section I want to think about is about 3 areas that provide a framing for good governance. I think the first area that we should consider is around evidence and making sure that that core data supports the processes and decisions that you're going to be making. So an example of that would be existing patient activity by site, by specialism, by geocoding, just to be able to make sure that you're really clear about where you are in the context in which you're taking any decisions or processes forward. The recent King's Fund report, the reconfiguration of clinical services, published in November last year, said that this was a really neglected area, and they had some difficulty in being able to draw a clear line between the decisions that were made and the evidence that was provided. I think this will become an increasing area of focus, especially for areas such as the clinical senate, that any reconfiguration proposal needs to be taken forward through, as the scrutiny of this base data and the decisions that it's supporting will become increasingly important. I think the second area is around process. So that's around inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Again, if we think about the way in which you move from the long list of clinical models to the preferred model or model that you're going to take forwards as in terms of the public consultation, being really clear about the way in which you're going to be able to go through that process, and for there to be a really clear audit trail and descriptors that would go and support that, both from an internal perspective, but also, more importantly, I think from an external perspective in terms of being able to really clearly demonstrate the process that you went through. That's not to say it shouldn't be iterative, and that's not to say that it shouldn't change to reflect the local needs of the health economy. But being clear about the process that's been gone through and making sure that that's robust and documented and well understood and can be clearly articulated is as important as the decision itself. The final area I want to focus on is around decision making. We've had committees in common as a way of going and supporting joint CCG decisions, and we've also got joint committees that NHS England has enabled recently. But being clear about the decisions that are being made and making sure that they're being taken in the appropriate forums is really important as well. In as much as having the process being clear about how the decision was being made and the support and the evidence, and being able to draw that really clear audit trail is important. Now, underlying all of this, we've got to be clear about the organisation and individual interests. Increasingly, it's quite difficult, especially when you're looking at moving services into the community with the increasing role that GP federations, for instance, are going to be playing in terms of primary care, being clear about how and where the decisions are being made, and also the relative interests of those people, those decisions that are being made, I think is going to be quite critical. Not necessarily in terms of the process that you would go through, but any challenges that would happen further down in the process. So Charlie, I'm going to break there just as a segue, just to see whether you've got any reflections or questions.
Great, thanks Simon. I think there's some really important foundations there, and certainly I've just spent the last couple of days with a system in the northeast thinking through how to get quite a large reconfiguration up and started around the extensivist model. So starting to extend out of primary care a service model that basically can support patients with more intensive needs than perhaps can be met through the sort of traditional format of 10-minute GP consultations. But it was fascinating to see play out exactly what you've just been talking about, the importance of thinking about their change methodology across a breadth of partners. And really echoing some of your first webinar sessions around, not just waiting for the sort of the formal public involvement stages or consultation stages, but actually building an understanding of what it was they wanted to do across the breadth of the system partners within that particular patch, including patient representatives and patient organisations. So I think you set this up really well, because I know what's coming in terms of some of the later slides and thinking through some methods of formalising some of those partnerships. So no, I'm looking forward to the next half of the session, because I think that will give us again some really good food for thought about how we get these things up and started. Thank you.
Okay, cheers Charlie. The next part, we're just going to think about the way in which programs can be structured and how this would support good governance and collaboration. Every local health economy has different approaches for the way in which they want to go and develop the program. A number of factors which can be long and varied would help shape the way in which you go and think about. But broadly speaking, there's three different approaches that you can go and take to this. You can look at an area specific, so in terms of the whole system. You can look at a function specific approach, or you can look at a clinical domain specific approach. I'll give you some examples in a minute, but it's just worth reflecting on the different aspects of this. Again, there is no right way of taking this forward. It's what fits the local context. But there is a clear there needs to be a clear linkage in whichever approach you take to the functions and duties of the CCG and the decision making that you need and the advisory nature of those programs that are provided. So I've pulled three different approaches that, one of which I was involved with, but two others that type of highlight the different approaches that we could be taken. So in Northwest London, which was a very large program across multiple health economies, they took an area approach. So the areas that we've got listed out are out of hospital, whole system integration, transforming mental health. So it wasn't as it was a broad process that probably within most other health systems would be a whole program in itself. In the second one, which is Healthier Together, they've focused it very much on functions. So transport and access, a clinical reference group, finance and estates. So this is a much more clearer linkage between which each group is doing and the sorts of areas that they're going to focus on. One of the key areas about this is then the interaction between those groups, and therefore the SRO group at the top is very important in terms of being able to bring this all together and make sense of this and agree and discuss and resolve the dependencies between these different groups. Again, the timings on this sort of approach is really important in terms of being able to get information that's timely between the groups in a way which is useful and helpful. And the program that I was involved in is much more focused on the domains in terms of the clinical processes. So we focused, whilst we had a clinical committee that sat over the whole whole program, the focus was very much on looking at specific clinical domains such as women and children, emergency care and elective care. There was also a finance committee and a PPS advisory committee, but it really was the clinical committees that went and drove the process forwards. So the next part of what we're going to look at is, are there some practical things that we can do that would support governance and collaboration? So we've talked about the way in which systems will come together. We talked about the way in which you could structure the program and the different, at a broad level, the different approaches that can be used. So what now are the practical steps that you could use to go and support this going forwards? So I'm going to focus on 4 areas: collaboration agreement, communications concordat, committee in common or joint committee, and your public patient and stakeholder forum. So a communications concordat is a document that sets out to align, provide clarity and certainty across the local health economy. It's meant to be signed up by all the parties that are involved in the decision-making process to make sure that they support the direction of the process. The idea with this document is that it increases public confidence that all the NHS organisations are seen to be seeking the same outcome, and it's really important during the engagement phase, where there will be a lot of interaction both between the programme but also between the various bodies supporting that they are all lined up in the right direction. However, the principles of the Comms Concordat need to operate at an individual informal level as well as between organisations. It's very easy for an organisation to sign up to something, but it's much more difficult to go and transact that when you're in a public board meeting and you're getting questions from the floor. But what it does seek to try and do is reduce the way in which there's a dissonance between the various messages that are being given out to the public. Again, there's a lot of evidence that if clinicians are clear and supportive and aligned to the process, public support for change is much more likely than if you've got a range of opinions, both at an individual level but at an organisational level. So the second area is a collaboration agreement. This is probably more appropriate for larger reconfigurations, which are multiple stakeholders to go and engage, where there's a real need to have the program run not as a function of an individual CCG or small group of CCGs, but you need to be clear about the way the decisions and delegations are going to be provided to the program. Again, just to reiterate, thinking about the way in which we talked about it in the first seminar, was that any program would be advisory and very much the decisions remain with the CCG governing bodies and its membership. Any collaboration agreement would broadly set out the development path by which you'd be taking that forward, and it might be a document that you want to review on a regular basis to make sure that all the organisations supporting it are aligned and have a clear way forwards. The final area that it should cover is transactional activities such as resourcing, finance and governance, so that there's a clear framework in which the programme is going to be making. This allows the programme to be supported, but with a clear understanding of its decision-making autonomy. What's important in terms of being able to do the process at pace is that especially within a larger program, it can't be used and run as an arm of an individual CCG. So therefore, a relative level of autonomy needs to be given to the program. But what needs to happen is, again, is around the confidence in the program that it's supporting the right decisions to be made, but also where it's unable to support those decisions, then it is bringing it back to the program board and the SROs for a decision about what needs to happen. So it's about trying to find the right balance, but this is a collaboration agreement very much provides a mechanism for supporting the way that the program will go forwards. The third area is the patient, public and stakeholder forum. So will be the mechanism by which patients and public and stakeholders are engaged. I'm not focusing here about the actual, the way in which you'd be consulting with the public, but it's very much about the supporting mechanism within the programme for helping decisions to be made. So it's about more than the assurance of the public consultation. It's being able to demonstrate a level of influence by the public and patients and stakeholders on the way that decisions are made and being able to demonstrate a level of influence over that. Again, it's about both making sure that the decisions that are made reflect, wherever possible, the interests of the local community, but also about being able to, where difficult decisions are needing to be made, that you've got a mechanism for engaging and debating that with your local stakeholders. It can also be used to help shape the way the whole community is engaged, and building upon some of the CCG and provider frameworks that are already out there, such as your PPI forums and other activities that have been undertaken to engage the public by the CCG. I very much think that this is something that needs to be prioritised at the early stage of the setup of the programme, as it can be used as a hub for later engagement. The earlier that you engage the public and the more transparent you're able to be with these stakeholder groups, I think whilst you might not be able to avoid challenge or concerns being raised, it does provide a mechanism for debate and engagement with those communities, which is within the programme and allows it to bend and flex rather than polarising positions across the various groups that would be involved. But I think the final thing is to say there's a balance between breadth and depth as well. It's important that you have as wide a view as possible in terms of this forum, but it's also about a depth, and therefore each programme needs to consider how it would engage with this forum, and whether other things like citizen panels for specific areas of decision making need to be considered as well, as a way of actually providing additional layers in terms of interaction and consideration to the decisions they're making, as well as having this as a sort of overarching framework. So the final area is around committees in common and joint committees. Where service reconfigurations cut across the commissioner boundaries, it's essential that there is a mechanism set up by which one or more CCG can exercise its function. The 2006 NHS Act didn't allow for joint committees, so committees in common have been widely identified and used, Manchester and London being the most obvious examples. From October 2014, CCGs were able to establish joint committees, which are both between CCGs, but also with NHS England, which wasn't able to do that as a committee in common. Again, I feel that this is something that can be developed and set up very early on in the process, rather than at the later point of the decision making in terms of the final public consultation. So key areas such as the case for change and the approval of the programme setup, I think if there was a way of being able to establish these so that there really is true joint ownership across the local health economy, is again something that provides good governance and also makes a clear statement of the commitment of all stakeholders to the way in which this is going to be taken forwards. One caveat with this obviously is that a committee in common is purely for the commissioners. So if you have a service reconfiguration programme, you need to be clear about the difference between decision making, which will be either through the governing bodies or the membership, and the advisory nature of the programme, which would be at the programme board or the clinical subgroups. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and this isn't legal advice I'm giving. So for each system, it's important that they go and seek their own legal advice to ensure that the context in which these decisions are being made are robust and sound. And also it's important to reflect that decision making will be important for the provider, because they will need to be accessing capital in order to support any changes to the delivery of service, be it acute or community or GP federation, etc. So whilst there is a decision-making process that is clearly around the service reconfiguration, there's also some aligned processes around decision-making which sit outside the programme but would be essential in terms of supporting that going forwards. So the last thing I just want to reflect on is that we're at the moment developing our reconfiguration roadmap, and we're seeking development partners to go and support this from April onwards. As I said, we've got the model and we're beginning to spin up the work to go and do this in terms of developing specifications. We have a steering group that's set up, but we're very interested in hearing from trusts and CCGs that will be interested in collaborating on this over the next 12 months in terms of being able to take this forward. So if you could get in touch with us at Arden Gem, very much appreciated, or via NHSIQ. And Charlie, that's it. So
thanks, Simon. That's really helpful. It's been a really good walkthrough. So to folks on the webinar and those joining by call, if you're on the webinar and you want to raise a question, please raise your hand using the grey box on the right-hand side, or use the chat field if it's easier for me to put that for you. I'll perhaps kick off, Simon. I think what, in terms of the approaches that you just described, given the scale and weight of what systems are looking to do, I think what you're saying is you might well use all of those that you described, because for me that echoes one of the themes of your series around the level of resources that are needed for the reconfiguration process, and perhaps some of the learning in the past has been an underappreciation of the resources that need to be in place from the outset. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's something which is a challenge for all CTGs, but the level of resourcing that's needed, not necessarily to progress the process forward, but it's the level of evidence to be able to defend against challenge going forwards, and as a function of that, being able to get through the NHS England gateways. That's quite significant now. If we think about the way in which the quality impact assessment needs to be considered, and the way that needs to be an audit trail between that, the clinical models and the decisions you're taking, and its relationship to the CCG duties, that's quite a complex area, and both be able to transact that and also document that in a way which is robust and is well understood is quite resource intensive, and I only see this sort of going one way in terms of the level of resourcing that's needed. I think it makes it very challenging for small CCGs or even small clusters of CCGs to really make big changes because of the level of support that's needed.
Thanks, Simon. That's really helpful. And just to say, on chat, I included a link to the former NHS Institute for Innovation and Improvement website, where there's quite a lot of resources around building collaborative agreements and compacts, and there's some really good stuff on there. Any questions from people who are perhaps just on the audio part of the call at this stage? Give people a moment to unmute themselves. No, nothing. Okay. I'm not sure whether people are able. Oh, hang on. I think I've got a hand. Bear with me.
Hiya. First, thanks a lot. I enjoyed that. I was wondering, What role do trusts have in the process you mentioned earlier about the decision-making and the governance side for CCGs?
Again, I think, so the trusts are it's very interesting in terms of their role and responsibilities. Obviously, first of all, they're a statutory body in their own right, and you would need them signed up within the overall governance process. However, they have specific roles both in terms of being able to develop and ensure the clinical models that are being developed, as well as being able to support the process going through areas such as the clinical senate. But I think the real crux is ensuring that any access to capital that's required is in place and can be secured, because that's not a CCG function, that's a provider function. And whilst the two processes are aligned, there is a need for the trust to be able, through an outlined business case, to be able to demonstrate the viability of the request for capital and how that would be serviced, and things like workforce, etc., which is not part of necessarily the decision-making process for commissioners. So, and I think there's also a secondary issue, which is where you have more than one provider that will be impacted by the proposal or the changes, how that would be managed within the programme. And again, I think its individual contexts are quite interesting here, in that I don't think there is one way of being able to do this, other than to say that it's quite important that there are open and frank discussions at an early stage, because it's something that could have an impact further down the decision-making process in terms of not being able to get everybody lined up and supporting the proposal when it's taken to the public.
Thanks, Simon. And for me, in terms of the sort of lead body or the lead forum, is there any pattern so far around whether it is CCGs or alliances of CCGs who are taking the lead, or have health and wellbeing boards started to get to the point of maturity where they're often the sort of lead forum as far as the reconfiguration effort goes? What's the learning at the moment?
Well, I think that's quite interesting, in that I think when health and wellbeing boards were established, that was very much seen as the decision-making forum that other health economies would look to. I think what's quite interesting now is that whilst it still seems to be a heavy focus on collaboration between the local authority and the CCGs outside of that health and wellbeing board, I don't quite understand the reasons for that. I suspect that it's around the health and wellbeing board has got quite a large span of responsibility in terms of assuring itself around the local health economy, whereas a service reconfiguration is very much specific to the commissioning intentions. I think the other challenge is obviously that the health and wellbeing board is commissioner focused in the broad sense, and not many providers that I'm aware of actually sit on health and wellbeing boards. So I think from a technical perspective, I think it also is quite challenging to have those sort of decision-making forums without the providers being involved. Yeah,
absolutely. And certainly in the work that I did over the last couple of days, I think that one of the reasons they're making headway is that very deliberate and close involvement of providers. And I wonder, that they were talking, their term, not mine, but they were talking very much about each partner having skin in the game around the rationale for the change and what the end state would be. And I think they were planning certainly to use something along the lines of a collaboration agreement to demonstrate that, and having that almost as an anchor from the outset to say, this is, obviously we're wedded to trying to deliver improved outcomes for the particular community, but really clearly they were sketching out what in their terms, the skin in the game was for each of the participant organisations, which I thought was really helpful. I'll give folk on the call or on the webinar another chance to ask any questions. Hang on, there's one just. So this is from Paul on the call, Simon, and he's asking, of the three types of approach to program structure, in your experience, is there a best approach?
I think if we go back and if we think about area, function, and domain, I think it really depends on the scale of what you're trying to achieve. So for a domain specific, it's easier if you're thinking about, say, stroke or pediatrics or elective, to just focus on an individual domain and have that as the driving function and the point at which your program is focused. And other areas such as workforce, estates, finance, equality, type of feed in and out of those functions. As the program gets larger, I think a different focus is needed. But then the issue there goes back to the one that you raised earlier, Charlie, around the resources that are required to go and support that. So if you think about functions and taking a functional approach, you've not only got having a clear distinction of estates as opposed to finance, the resources that are required to go and support that, but also the interdependencies between those various functions, because they're all going to be running at different speeds. So I think it really does come down to the speed and the breadth of which you're wanting to do things, but it's also about the level of resource commitment that you're willing to go and do to go and achieve that change.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks, Simon. Last chance for folks on the webinar or call to raise questions before I give a final chance to Simon just to repeat the offer around getting in touch if you're involved in reconfiguration, you want to be part of this work. In the meantime, wanted to thank Tom and Marie-Louise for all their support to set up these events, and undertake that Simon will come back to us with some proposals around a further series of webinars. I know they can be really good for addressing some hot topics and providing exchange opportunities for folks who are in the midst of change. There's also a slide up now around feedback via a really quick SurveyMonkey survey. And there's the contact address there if you're involved in reconfiguration and you want further information or to share some of your experience or raise any questions on the back of today's discussions. Simon, anything else you want to raise before I wrap up the session?
No. Thank you very much for hosting that, Charlie. As I said, if you're interested in collaborating with us as in terms of becoming a development partner around supporting the roadmap, or you just want some more information on some of the thoughts we've had to dive into a bit more detail, please get in touch.
Great. Thanks ever so much, Simon, for these 2 sessions. I think you've given us some really good food for thoughts about issues and getting these things underway. And thanks very much for everybody who joined today's and the other 2 sessions. They are recorded, and we'll share details of the recordings after the session. Thanks very much for your time, everybody.